The fluorescent light above the bathroom sink had been flickering for 3 weeks. I kept meaning to replace it. That's the kind of thing you notice when your life has been stripped down to almost nothing. A flickering bulb in a studio apartment that smells like the previous tenant's cigarettes and your own regret. 6 months earlier, I had been a senior structural engineer at Meridian Construction Group, pulling in $240,000 a year, including bonuses, signing off on projects worth tens of millions. I drove a company truck, had a corner office on the 14th floor, and a wife named Claire who kissed me goodbye every morning like she meant it. I should have paid more attention to the flickering. In life, in fluorescent bulbs, in people's eyes, the warning signs are usually there. You just get too comfortable to look. The morning everything collapsed started like any other Tuesday. I was on site at a new hospital wing in Riverside when my site foreman, a thick-armed ex-Marine named Hector, walked up to me holding his phone like it was a live grenade. "Danny," he said. He only called me Danny when something was wrong. There are 2 guys in suits at the main office. They got badges. I thought it was an OSHA inspection. We were compliant on everything. I even felt mildly smug about it as I drove back to headquarters. It wasn't OSHA. It was 2 investigators from the State Contractor Licensing Board and 1 detective from the Financial Crimes Unit. They sat me down in the conference room where I'd eaten probably 300 lunches, and they slid a folder across the table with my name on it. Someone had been signing contracts using my digital credentials. 3 subcontractor agreements, 2 materials invoices, and a change order that redirected $412,000 to a shell company registered in Delaware that I had never heard of. The payments had been processed over 14 months. The digital trail led directly to my login, my authorized signature, my professional license number. I told them I didn't do it, that I had never seen these documents, that someone must have accessed my credentials. The detective, a woman named Reyes with reading glasses and 0 patience, looked at me the way people look at a child who just insisted the dog ate his homework. I was placed on administrative leave that afternoon. My badge was deactivated before I reached the parking garage. I drove home in my personal car because the company truck had already been logged as returned. When I got home, Claire was in the kitchen. She had made pasta, my favorite, and there was a bottle of wine open on the counter. She looked at me with those gray eyes I'd fallen in love with 11 years ago and said, "I heard. I'm so sorry, baby. We'll figure this out." I believed her. I sat down and ate the pasta and drank the wine and thought, at least I have her. At least there's this. 3 weeks later, she filed for divorce. She said she couldn't handle the uncertainty, that she needed stability, that she had been unhappy for a while, and this had just accelerated a decision she'd already been considering. I moved into the studio apartment with the flickering light. I took 2 suitcases and the cast iron skillet my mother had left me. Claire kept the house, the joint savings, about $80,000, and the Labrador retriever named Biscuit, who had technically been my dog before we met. I got a job driving deliveries for a medical supply company. The pay was $14 an hour. My engineering license was under review, pending the investigation. My lawyer, a tired man named Gerald, who smelled of instant coffee and defeat, told me the case was complex and that I should remain optimistic. Gerald was not optimistic, I could tell. The only good thing about the delivery job was a guy named Ray. Ray was 61, had a white beard that made him look like a skinnier Santa Claus, and had been driving for the company for 9 years after retiring early from the post office. He knew every shortcut, every diner, every gas station with clean bathrooms between here and the county line. He also knew everyone's business whether they told him or not. On my first day, he looked me over in the break room and said, "You're the engineer, the one from Meridian." I said yes. He handed me a coffee and said, "You didn't do it." Not a question, a statement. I asked him how he knew. "Guilty men don't look confused," he said. "They look worried. You look confused." Ray became my only social life. We ate lunch together most days. He'd been through his own version of a bad decade, a car accident, a lawsuit, a daughter who didn't speak to him for 2 years. He had the particular wisdom of someone who had survived being wrong about almost everything. About 4 months into the job, Ray pulled up beside me in the warehouse parking lot one Thursday afternoon and said, with no preamble whatsoever, "Your ex-wife's boyfriend works at Cascade Permit Services." I stared at him. "The company that submitted the permit paperwork on 2 of the 3 projects with the forged contracts," he added, like he was telling me the weather. I asked him how he knew that. "My nephew Dennis works at the county assessor's office. He sees the permit filings. He recognized the Meridian project numbers because I mentioned them." Ray shrugged. "Also, Your ex-wife's boyfriend is named Todd Packard and he coaches youth soccer on Wednesdays at Grover Park. My granddaughter is on the team. I sat in my car for a long time after Ray drove away. Todd Packard. I met him exactly once. At a company barbecue Claire had dragged me to about 2 years before everything fell apart. He worked in permitting. I remembered him as someone who laughed too loud at his own jokes and wore boat shoes without socks in October. I went home and sat at my kitchen table with a legal pad and wrote down what I knew. Claire was an accountant. She had access to financial systems. She had worked as a contractor for Meridian for 18 months before we even got married. That's how we met, actually, at a project kickoff meeting. She knew the internal systems. She knew my login habits. She knew I left my laptop open when I walked to the coffee machine. I thought about our honeymoon. We had planned to go to Hawaii. Claire had switched it at the last minute to a resort in the Bahamas. I'd thought nothing of it. Who complains about the Bahamas? Banking laws in the Bahamas are different. I went to the bathroom and stared at the flickering light for a long time. Then I changed the bulb. It seemed important to do something I could actually fix. The problem was I had no money, no access to the company's systems, no standing to conduct any kind of investigation, and a lawyer whose primary communication strategy was managing my expectations downward. I also had a delivery route to complete by 6 o'clock. I told Ray everything the next day over gas station sandwiches in the company parking lot. He listened without interrupting, which is rarer than people think. When I finished, he said, "You need Dennis." Dennis, it turned out, was not just Ray's nephew. Dennis had worked at the county assessor's office for 11 years and knew the permit filing system the way a pianist knows a keyboard. He could pull the history on any permit application, track the associated entities, cross-reference the licensed contractors, and identify irregularities in submission patterns. He'd actually flagged 2 cases of permit fraud for the DA's office in the last 3 years, on his own time because he found it interesting. Dennis was also, Ray warned me, deeply strange. How strange? I asked. He communicates primarily through text message and refuses to eat anything that isn't beige, Ray said. But he's the sharpest person I know, and he doesn't like liars. We met Dennis at a diner. He ordered plain toast and a bowl of oatmeal, and I walked him through everything. He listened while staring at the table, barely blinking. When I finished, he asked me 3 questions with the precision of a surgeon. The exact dates of the forged documents, the name of the Delaware shell company, and whether Claire had ever had access to my professional license renewal portal. Yes to all 3. He didn't look up from his oatmeal. Give me a week. For 7 days I drove my route, ate gas station sandwiches with Ray, and tried not to think about the fact that my career, my marriage, and $240,000 a year had all been dismantled by a woman who had kissed me goodbye every morning like she meant it. On the 8th day, Dennis texted Ray, who called me. We met back at the diner. Dennis had a folder. Not a digital file, an actual printed folder, organized with color-coded tabs, because Dennis was that kind of person. The shell company in Delaware, Bridgewater Structural Consulting LLC, had been registered 14 months before the first forged invoice. The registered agent was a law firm that handled about 40 similar entities, but the initial filing address was a UPS store on Clement Street, the same UPS store where Claire had maintained a personal mailbox for 6 years. Dennis had cross-referenced it through a public business filing database. Todd Packard had submitted the permit applications for 2 of the 3 affected projects. His employer, Cascade Permit Services, had processed over $2 million in fees associated with Meridian projects in the last 3 years, significantly higher than their typical volume. And the bank account linked to Bridgewater Structural Consulting had been opened in person at a branch in Nassau, Bahamas in June of 2 years ago. We had gone to the Bahamas in May of 2 years ago. I remembered sitting on the beach while Claire went back to the resort to rest. She'd been gone for 4 hours. I'd ordered another drink and fallen asleep in the sun and woken up with a spectacular sunburn on my left arm. She'd brought me aloe and been very tender about applying it. I put my face in my hands. Ray patted me on the back. Dennis ate his toast. "I'm sorry," Dennis said, without particular emotion. "People are frequently terrible." I asked him what I was supposed to do with this. "That depends on what you want," he said. "If you want revenge, you'll probably destroy yourself in the process and achieve nothing. If you want justice, you report it to the correct authorities and let the system work. If you want both, you do the second thing and the first thing becomes a byproduct." I looked at Ray. "He's not wrong," Ray said. The problem with reporting to the authorities was that I had already told the authorities, the state board and the financial crimes detective, that I hadn't done it. They had been deeply unimpressed. My word against a digital trail that had been engineered to lead directly to me. What I needed was for someone was standing to look in a different direction. Dennis had anticipated this. He slid a printed sheet across the table. The IRS has a whistleblower program. If you report tax fraud and the IRS recovers money as a result, you receive between 15 and 30% of the collected amount. More importantly, a whistleblower report triggers a parallel investigation that operates independently from the state board inquiry. It creates a second set of eyes. I looked at the sheet. The shell company would have underreported income. Almost certainly, Dennis said. That's how these structures work. So I report to the IRS, they investigate independently, and if they find what we found. They find what we found plus everything we couldn't access, Dennis said. Bank records, wire transfers, communications, things that require a subpoena. Ray was nodding slowly. Let the system work. I filed the IRS whistleblower report from a public library computer the following Tuesday. I described the shell company, the UPS store connection, the Bahamas account, the permit filing patterns. I included Dennis's documentation with his permission as supporting attachments. Then I went back to work. I drove my route. I ate gas station sandwiches. I called my mother on Sundays and told her things were progressing, which was almost true. 3 months passed. My lawyer, Gerald, called occasionally to tell me there was nothing new to report, which I'd come to understand was his way of saying he was still billing hours. I started running in the mornings because it was free and it burned off the anger that collected overnight like water in a leaky basement. I also, unexpectedly, started talking to my neighbor. She lived in the unit across the hall, a woman named Patricia who was in her mid-50s, recently widowed, and possessed of a directness that could be alarming until you got used to it. She worked as a school principal and seemed constitutionally incapable of small talk. The first real conversation we had was when she knocked on my door at 9 in the evening to tell me that the sound of me pacing was coming through her ceiling and was I all right. I said I was fine. She said I was clearly not fine and did I want tea. I said yes, mostly because I didn't know how to say no to her. She made very good tea. She also listened the way good principals listen, without interrupting, without rescuing, without offering premature solutions. When I finished talking, she was quiet for a moment and then said, "My late husband once told me that the hardest part of being wronged isn't the wrong itself. It's realizing that the person who wronged you knew you well enough to do it precisely." I thought about that for several days. Patricia and I fell into a habit of Tuesday evenings. She would knock, or I would knock, and whoever had tea would make it. We talked about her students, my engineering work, her late husband who had been a jazz musician, my mother who had been a school teacher. We did not talk about Claire, or Todd Packard, or the IRS, or the flickering light that I had finally fixed. I was not, in any way, looking for anything to happen. I just wanted to be in a room with someone who assumed I was a decent person. About 5 months after I filed the whistleblower report, I was finishing my route on a Thursday afternoon when my phone rang. Unknown number from a Washington, D.C. area code. The man identified himself as Special Agent Warren Okafor from the IRS Criminal Investigation Division. He said they had received my whistleblower submission and had been conducting an independent investigation. He said they had some questions and would I be available to come in. I said yes before he finished the sentence. The field office interview was 2 hours long. Agent Okafor was methodical and quiet and did not appear to have any opinions, which I later decided was a professional skill. He went through every detail of my submission. He showed me documents, redacted, mostly, and asked me to confirm or deny connections. He asked about the Bahamas trip with a specificity that told me he already knew exactly what had happened there. When we were done, he shook my hand and said the investigation was ongoing and I should not discuss the meeting with anyone outside of my legal counsel. I called Gerald from the parking lot. For once, Gerald sounded awake. 6 weeks after that interview, Detective Reyes, the one who had looked at me like I was a homework-eating dog, called me directly to say that the financial crimes investigation was being reopened in light of new evidence obtained through a parallel federal inquiry. She said it with a clipped tone of someone who does not enjoy being wrong but is professional enough to do it anyway. I chose not to enjoy the moment. Much. The state board suspended their disciplinary proceedings pending the outcome of the federal investigation. Gerald called me twice in one day, which was unprecedented. I went across the hall and knocked on Patricia's door. She opened it and took one look at my face and said, "Good news?" I said yes. She made tea. The full picture that emerged over the following months was worse than I had imagined and, in a strange way, clarifying. Claire had begun the plan approximately 2 years into our marriage. Around the time I was promoted to senior engineer and started signing off on larger projects, she had cultivated the relationship with Todd, who was already working in permit services and had access to the documentation pipeline. She had systematically copied my login credentials over several months, practiced my digital signature pattern, and established the Delaware entity through a lawyer who would later receive a separate charge for knowing participation. The Bahamas account held at its peak just over $600,000. The DA's office described Claire in their filing as having shown a calculated and sustained pattern of deception maintained over multiple years. Todd received a separate indictment for his role in the permit fraud. My lawyer, Gerald, to his credit, had been building a civil case in parallel that I hadn't fully understood. When my criminal case was formally dismissed, every charge vacated, he filed the civil suit against Claire for the full amount diverted plus damages. She had already begun moving assets in anticipation of this, but the IRS had gotten there first. It wasn't everything, but it was enough. My engineering license was reinstated 4 months after the criminal dismissal. Meridian offered me my job back. I thought about it for a week and then said no. The building where I'd eaten 300 lunches felt like a place that belonged to someone else's wife. Instead, I went to see a man named Howard Breisch, who owned a small structural consulting firm in the same industrial park where I picked up medical supplies. I delivered to his office twice a week for almost a year, and we got into talking. He was 63, wanted to slow down, and had more projects than he could handle. We shook hands over a desk covered in blueprints and engineering spec sheets, and I felt, for the first time in 2 years, like myself. Ray threw a small party in the break room of the medical supply warehouse. He made a sheet cake with "Good riddance, Danny" written on it in blue frosting, which he said was celebratory but could also mean me leaving the job if I looked at it right. Dennis came, ate a plain cracker he had brought himself, and shook my hand with the gravity of a man signing a peace treaty. I stood in that break room with a paper-plated sheet cake and looked at these two people, a retired postal worker with a Santa Claus beard and his strange, methodical nephew who had helped me when they had no particular reason to. And I thought about what the right word was for that. Family, I decided. Not the kind you're born into. The kind that shows up. Patricia came to the party too because Ray had apparently called her and invited her without telling me. She stood near the coffee machine looking mildly amused by the good riddance cake and handed me a card that said, on the inside, in her principal's handwriting, "You're a decent person. I thought you should have that in writing." I kept the card. It's on my desk at Breisch Structural now, next to my coffee mug. The IRS whistleblower award came through 8 months later. 15% of the recovered taxes on the underreported income from the shell company. After Gerald's fees and the taxes on the award itself, the number that landed in my account was $91,000. I'm not going to pretend that solved everything. It didn't bring back 2 years, or my dog Biscuit, or the version of my life I had assumed I was building, but it paid off the debt I'd accumulated during the investigation. It funded the buy-in at Breisch Structural, and it bought me a coffee machine that doesn't require powdered creamer, which felt, at the time, like a significant upgrade. Claire was convicted on 4 counts, including wire fraud and tax evasion. She received 7 years. Todd got 4. The lawyer got 18 months and a permanent bar from practicing in the state. I don't know what I expected to feel when the verdict came through. Some version of satisfaction, maybe. What I actually felt was tired. The good kind. The kind after a long run when your legs are empty and your head is quiet and the world seems like a manageable size. Patricia and I had dinner that evening. Nothing celebratory, just a meal. She had made roast chicken, and there was a bottle of wine, and we sat at her kitchen table and talked about her plans to retire in 3 years and what I was going to do with the Breisch projects we had just picked up. At one point, she looked at me across the table and said, "For what it's worth, you handled this with more grace than most people would." I thought about the legal pad on my kitchen table, the library computer, the months of driving a delivery route while my life was being sorted out by people with subpoenas. I thought about Ray handing me coffee on my first day and Dennis eating plain toast and saying people are frequently terrible with the same tone another person might use to comment on the weather. I told her I wasn't sure grace was the right word. "Patience then," she said. "You let the right thing happen instead of forcing the wrong thing." I raised my glass and she raised hers, and outside the window, it was an ordinary Thursday evening in late October, which is exactly what I needed it to be. The flickering light is long gone. The apartment still smells faintly of the previous tenant's cigarettes, but I've started to think of it less as someone else's residue and more as evidence that people pass through hard places and come out the other side. There's something almost comforting in that if you let it be. I still meet Ray for lunch sometimes. He drives for the medical supply company 3 days a week now, semi-retired. He always has opinions about my projects and strong feelings about gas station coffee versus diner coffee. And I have come to understand that listening to him is one of the better uses of my time. Dennis sends me occasional texts, Never about anything personal, always about permit irregularities or structural anomalies in publicly filed documents, as though he has designated me his audience for professional observations. I always write back. It seems like the decent thing to do. And Patricia is across the hall when she's not at school, and sometimes the tea is at my place and sometimes it's at hers, and we are in no hurry about any of it. My mother asked me last Sunday if I was happy. I told her I was getting there, which is the most honest thing I know how to say. She said that was enough. That getting there is the whole trip. I think she's right. She usually is.